So as we prepare to celebrate the sesquicentennial of Hickory next year, let's take a train ride to one of the last stops on the Western North Carolina Railroad in 1870. A round-trip ticket from Wilmington cost $22.80. According to the local railroad agent, Hickory Tavern is a thriving town of several hundred inhabitants, which has been built up since the close of the war. There are 10 stores here and a number of workshops, and anything needed in any part of the country can be obtained at this place. Over the last 12 months, more than 18,000 pounds of butter and 215,000 pounds of dried fruit and berries have been shipped from here. Described as one of the healthiest places to be found anywhere, with a peculiarly delightful climate, the railroad agent predicts that Hickory Tavern is destined to become one of the finest places for business in Western North Carolina. And he was right. Before the decade was out, a local gristmill owner, let's call him Uncle Andy, and an engineer and architect in New York would create what became, in Gary Freese's words, one of the most conspicuous examples of New South prosperity in North Carolina. The Piedmont Wagon Company shipped its products throughout the South and made Hickory nationally famous for decades. Of course, this is only part of the story. Writing 50 years later, a local U.S. district attorney noted that the present generation can never have a faint conception of the condition of society in North Carolina from 1861 to 1871. Blood and carnage, fire and sword, famine, starvation, arson, murder, slander, ostracism, and threats of personal abuse. And he was right, too. When Uncle Andy fled this county in the summer of 1870, lacerated with stripes from his shoulders to his hips, he didn't know who he could trust. The band of disguised men, numbering some 30 or 40, who Ku Kluxed him on the 7th of June, undoubtedly included some county justices and officers of the law, not to mention some of his own kinsmen. He recognized the voice of 3 of the men. One had married a girl that his father-in-law was guardian for, so he was sort of a brother-in-law. Another was married to his second cousin. A third was a distant cousin of a girl that his own son would marry before the decade was out. These 3 men were later indicted by the federal government, but the outrage of Andrew Ramseur, as it was described in the Weekly Standard in Raleigh at the time, never resulted in any convictions. But this is only part of the story, too. The part that still hasn't been told, at least since Uncle Andy testified about it to the United States Senate in March of 1871, is the racial terror lynching in this county of a young black man named Newton Wilfong. The disguised band had a grudge against him for being too impudent, Uncle Andy said. You know, talking too big. That was the principal cause. He was whipped several times, and the last time they shot him, and he died. Who was Newton Wilfong? I wish I could tell you more, But Uncle Andy's Senate testimony is the only evidence that apparently remains of his short existence. I've been unable to find his name in any local census records or other historical artifacts of the time. And his name isn't engraved on any monuments or historical markers today. As the future founder of the Southern Historical Collection put it in 1906, writing about Reconstruction in North Carolina more generally, the matter never attracted any public attention. Since formerly enslaved people like Newton Wilfong were so constantly moving about that the sudden disappearance of one without a family excited no comment, until it did. Just a decade later, the lynching of Elijah Church, 2 miles east of the Catawba County Courthouse, was covered by all of the local press. Elijah was arrested in Alexander County. They moved him to the Catawba County Jail from Taylorsville because they were afraid that he would be lynched there. That did not prevent his lynching. A band of men, none of whom wore disguises, rode into town, kidnapped him from the county jail, and hanged him from a tree. According to the Hickory press, they were respectable, fine-looking gentlemen, not one of whom made any attempt at disguise. And although the moon was shining bright that night, the Hickory press continued, not a single man of the party was recognized by anyone. So just like in the case of Newton Wilfong, the perpetrators of the lynching of Elijah Church were never brought to justice. But his tale was mentioned in local newspaper accounts. But a lot of the names will just never be known because they weren't documented at the time. The historical record is not always as clear and complete as we would like it to be. So I want to give a call out here to Gary Fries, who's with us today. I quoted him earlier. Thank you, Gary, for encouraging me to look into this topic and assisting me as I've gone through some of the research and findings. I appreciate that. I also want to thank Richard Eller, who's going to host a panel discussion later that's a little more on the bright side. Richard has also been helpful and encouraged me to reach out and do this TED Talk, and has also provided some great feedback during my research on this project. But again, a lot of the names will never be known. My family and I visited the lynching museum in Montgomery last year. It's an amazing and very somber place. If you haven't been, I encourage you to go. The scale is a bit overwhelming. The Equal Justice Initiative has now engraved the names of over 4,000 victims of racial terror lynching between 1877 and 1950 on these steel columns that hang from the ceiling, as you can see here. And there's no marker currently there for, each column, by the way, represents a county in one of 12 southern states where lynchings have been documented to occur. There's no column there currently for Catawba County. But I'd like to talk about some of the other people, getting back to Uncle Andy and the Klan incidents around 1870. I'd like to talk to you about just a few minutes about some of the other people that were impacted by those events. And I'll say a few names here as we go through, but I don't have any evidence that these other people were actually lynched, although, again, the historical record is not clear. Some of them just disappear. So if you don't remember anything else about this talk, I want you to remember the name Newton Wilfong. Because Uncle Andy went to the U.S. Senate and testified about this in 71. I should point out that Andy Ramser is not my uncle. In terms of my genealogy research, I've only confirmed that he's a third cousin 5 times removed. But so are some of the perpetrators of the Klan violence, one of whom I'll mention from a neighboring county as we go through the list of a couple of other people that were impacted. First, I'd like to mention Letty Wilfong. They were both whipped by the Klan, according to Uncle Andy. In terms of census records, I'm able to find a Mahala Wilfong living in Burke County in 1900, which would have made her about 30 years old at the time of these Klan incidents. But Letty Wilfong, not able to find her in any census records at all. There was also a 14-year-old girl named Dora Wilfong, who was listed on the 1870 census as living with Uncle Andy and his family at Jacobs Fort. I find no evidence of Dora Wilfong after the 1870 census. What happened to her? Still unclear. The research continues. I'd also like to mention a black man by the name of Rufus Reinhardt. I think Rufus was a nickname, and his real name was Alexandra Reinhardt. In 1868, he married a black woman in Lincoln County, Rufus was a black man. He married a white woman named Alice Love in Lincoln County. A local jury deferred to the judge about whether their marriage was valid. The judge ruled that it was, but the prosecutors took the case to the state Supreme Court, who essentially annulled their marriage. And I find no records of either Alice Love or Rufus Reinhardt after 1870. I'd also like to mention a woman named Emmeline Shuford. Emmeline was not listed by Uncle Andy as a victim of the Klan violence, but she was a witness in one of the federal cases. In 1873, she was convicted of child murder in Newton and sentenced to hang. Another third cousin, 5 times removed, and a prominent Klansman and lawyer and judge in Lincoln County, took her case to the state Supreme Court and got her a new trial. I've yet to find the court records to find out what happened to her on her retrial, but again, I found no evidence of her existence in any census or other historical records after 1870. I'd finally like to mention a black man named Lawson Blackburn, who was also whipped by the Klan in 1869, 1870. Uncle Andy described him as one of the best servants in the county. He had done as well as any man. In 1872, Him and his family raised 1,200 bushels of corn, sharecropping on a farm near Shelby. They whipped him, Uncle Andy said, because he voted for the Constitution. Which brings us to the likely source of Newton Wilfong's impotence, as well as Uncle Andy's radical principles. Uncle Andy had drawn the ire of the local clan because he voted with a number of black men in the county for the new state constitution in 1868, which abolished slavery and provided for universal male suffrage. He campaigned for radical candidates for office. He tried to raise the American flag at the county courthouse. He didn't support ethnic cleansing. I'm sorry if you were expecting a nostalgic story about our past, but I think this story is an important one that needs to be told. And again, if you remember nothing else about this talk, don't remember the name of Andrew Ramser. Remember Newton Wilfong and Elijah Church. And help us do something to help make this to foster a more compassionate community in Hickory. Thank you.